Hi, this is Andy and Sharon McClellan from Father's House. Welcome to this teaching session. We pray that you will be blessed and grow as a result of listening today.
If I were to ask you, what do you think of the law? What would be the first thing that would come into your head? Maybe a complex legal system that constrains us for absolutely no good reason. Now, the Apostle Paul tells us that we are no longer living under law, we're living under grace. But what was the law? Was it a curse or was it a blessing? Do you know what? There are some very strange laws out there today. Did you know that in the state of Arizona, it is illegal to take a cutting from a cactus? And if you're caught, then it could mean a 25-year jail sentence. In Switzerland, there is a nighttime curfew banning the flushing of a toilet in certain apartment blocks between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. Likewise, you can actually be prosecuted for running a bath during these hours or for showering for more than 20 minutes, as it would be considered a public disturbance. Wearing a kilt is an arrestable offence in Italy. And I find that hard to believe, bearing in mind that that was the very country which exported toga-clad Roman soldiers throughout Europe, and they now ban men from wearing skirts or kilts of any nature. And if you're living in Ireland and you're contemplating a move to Western Australia, then it's worth bearing in mind that it is illegal to be in possession of more than 50 kilos of potatoes at any given time. Kissing is prohibited on trains in France, but you can smooch on the platform if the train hasn't yet entered the station. And one of my personal favorites, you need a special permit if you are planning to take a photograph of a bunny rabbit in Wyoming in the USA between the months of January and April. I kid you not. Man-made laws were usually established to protect the weak and vulnerable in society, or to preserve the environment, and possibly to preserve the dignity of rabbits. I don't know, but man-made laws continually need to be updating, or they would quickly become superficial and even irrational. God's laws, too, were about protecting the weak and vulnerable, but they were also about forming, preserving, and protecting relationships between man and man and God. And if you don't believe me, take a quick read through the 10 Commandments, but not right now. Please wait until I've finished. Last time I was speaking was on Palm Sunday, and I mentioned how Moses instigated the practice of publicly reading a passage from the Torah every week. Now, we maybe equate Torah with law, but Torah is actually Hebrew for teaching or instruction. And the Torah consists of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, from Genesis through to Deuteronomy. And to this day, synagogues around the world continue to read a weekly passage known as the parashah, so that the entire Torah is heard within a year. Now, I always struggle when I'm asked to speak. I just don't know where to start. There are so many things that I'd love to share. So I thought I would look up and see what the parashah, what the passage is for this weekend. Yesterday, on the Shabbat, the Sabbath, would have been read. Actually, if you're interested in researching more about the Torah reading plan, then I'm just throwing in one wee detail that you need to bear in mind. The Jewish New Year begins in September with the festival of Rosh Hashanah, which means head of the year. So we're now actually a good 30 or 31 weeks into the reading plan. So here in the West, the first 5 books of the Old Testament really are probably the least likely passages you will ever hear a sermon based upon. Like, how many times have you heard someone preach on Levitical law? So I thought I'll use this week's parashah as a starting point for my sermon and see where it takes us. After all, David wrote in Psalm 119, verse 103, "Your word is like honey on my lips," or more precisely, "How sweet to my taste are your commandments," or your Imra. And the only commandments that David would have known would have been the 5 books of Moses. And that would have included the long lists of numbers and genealogies in the books of Numbers and the repetitive lists of sacrifice in Leviticus. Yesterday's Shabbat reading, or Sabbath reading as we call it in English, included some chapters from Leviticus, beginning at Leviticus chapter 16. And it's actually just the very first verse that caught my attention, Leviticus 16, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron when they drew near before the Lord and died. And it just stopped me in my tracks. Why did Aaron's two sons die? Because they drew near to the Lord. What about the verse in James 4 verse 8? Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Has God changed the goalposts? And maybe there's a problem with the English translation. So I took a closer look at the phrase that has been translated into English as after the death of the two sons of Aaron when they drew near before the Lord and died. The Hebrew word in Leviticus 16 verse 1 translated as draw near is bakarabatam, which is based on the root word karab, and it means to come near or approach. So basically there isn't a lot wrong with saying that they drew near to God, but there's something else going on here. What did they do that would cause them to die? The full story is actually found 6 chapters earlier in Leviticus chapter 10, and it's a chapter that I've never heard anyone speak on. So I just basically said to God, you lead me, you direct me, as I've no idea where this is going to take us. And I was quite fascinated where it did take us. So please stay tuned. We're going to do some detective work. Leviticus 10 verses 1 to 8. The ESV translation basically entitles it, The Death of Nadab and Abihu. Now, Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer. We probably aren't familiar with the word censer, but it's related to the word incense and incendiary device, which are basically things that are burnt. So another way of putting it would be to say the Hebrew word makta is a fire carrier. So Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took their fire carrier. The sons of Aaron each took their fire carrier and put fire in it and laid incense on it and offered unauthorized fire or strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord has said, among those who are near me, I will be sanctified, and before all the people, I will be glorified. And Aaron held his peace. And Moses called Mishael and Elzaphan, the sons of Uziel, the uncle of Aaron, and said to them, come near, carry your brothers away from the front of the sanctuary and out of the camp. So they came near and carried him in their coats out of the camp, as Moses had said. And Moses said to Aaron and Eleazar and Ithamar, his sons, those are basically the two other brothers, do not let the hair of your heads hang loose. Do not tear your clothes, lest you die, and wrath come upon you. The congregation, but let the brothers, the whole house of Israel, bewail the burning that the Lord has kindled. And do not go outside the entrance of the tent of meeting, lest you die. For the anointing oil of the Lord is upon you. And they did according to the word of Moses. So let's do some detective work. I'm going to basically draw some questions up and then see where it takes us if we can answer them all. Let's do some detective work. What are the key phrases? What questions do we need to look at? First of all, we need to establish whether Nadab and Abihu should even have been carrying fire. Who were they? Have you even heard of them before? Were they even priests? What do Nadab and Abihu mean? Because maybe there's something in their name which was their calling. And what was their calling? Second question, what was the unauthorized fire? Is fire not fire? If the fire was different to other fire, then how did they come by this fire? Where did they get it? Thirdly, what does it explicitly say that why does it explicitly say that Aaron held his peace? His two sons had just been consumed by fire, and he said nothing? Was it plain for everyone to see that Nadab and Abihu were in the wrong? And if they were, then why is it not immediately obvious to us as well? We also learn that Moses told them to not let their hair hang loose or tear their clothes. Well, that could be an issue if it still applies to our churches today. If there was a danger in anyone letting their hair hang loose or having ripped jeans, Sharon, just saying, there's something significant going on here, and we miss it in our modern day culture. But it seems to be something very important if Moses told them not to do those things. Finally, if the people weren't already shocked at this spontaneous combustion, how would they respond when the warning came that they should not step outside of the tent of meeting? Was God lacking compassion, announcing that they would be in an even worse danger if they tried to leave? Is there an important lesson here that applies to us today? So, first question, bottom line, who were Nadab and Abihu, and why were they carrying fire in their censers or their fire holders? Now we know that Nadab and Abihu were Aaron's sons. Maybe they were unworthy to continue the line as priests. We know from the book of Samuel that Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests, and yet they abused the sacrificial system. But do any of us really understand the sacrificial system? Don't worry, you will do by the end of today, I promise, and it won't be that complicated. In layman's terms, think of what happens at Christmas time when you want to boil your gammon. I usually boil it in the slow cooker before finishing it off in the oven. When meat is boiled, it becomes very tender and it falls apart easily. Now, under Levitical law, the priest was permitted to get a large three-pronged fork and insert it into the boiled meat and take some for himself, but not Hophni and Phinehas. 1 Samuel 2 tells us that they would demand that the raw meat be given to them, so they basically could take the entire slab, whereas if it was straight from the boiling water, only a small amount would come away in their hand. So were Nadab and Abihu similar? The name Nadab is Hebrew for noble and generous. So it doesn't sound like he was cut from the same cloth as Hophni and Phinehas, who were basically greedy and stole from the Lord. Other than referring to Aaron's oldest son, the word Nadab is found 18 times in the Old Testament. And every time it is consistently used to mean a free will offering, to volunteer, to make an offering, to willingly give. So it isn't hard to see how the name Nadab was basically a calling to be noble and generous. And in fact, probably in most of our churches, those are the sort of people that every minister wants to have, someone who's going to be offering their services and freely giving financially and in their time, whatever. If we go a stage deeper and look at the Hebrew letters, the name is spelt Nun Daleth Beit. And I've spoken before on how the primitive Hebrew words, actually the DNA of the word is actually found within the letters. It's fascinating. Basically, the letters are like early hieroglyphics. So I've spoken before on that, but just to give you the essence of the word, the first letter is Nun, or N as we know it in English. And Nun is the Hebrew word for a seed or a fish. If you lived on the coast, then a fish would be your Nun. And if you farmed the land, then Nun was a seed of grain. Here in Ireland, you might think of a Nun as being a seed potato. Nun carries the idea of being a seed of faith. You can eat your fish, or your handful of grain, or your baby boiled potato, or you can exercise some faith and use the small fish as a tiddler, as bait to catch a bigger fish. Or you could plant your seeds and potatoes in the hope that there'll be a bigger return when the grain or the potatoes grow. Middle letter Daleth, or D, is Hebrew for a doorway or an opening, an opportunity. You could translate it that way. So when a Daleth occurs in the middle of a word, it suggests that the first letter, which in this case was Nun, creates an opportunity for something to happen. And that something was the bait, which is the final letter, B-E-I-T. Some English translations refer to Nadab as Nadav, because the final letter in Hebrew, the bait can be pronounced as vait, or bait as a soft sound or whatever. So I might occasionally call him Nadab and Abihu, or it could be Nadab and Abihu, but it's basically the same name. So beit in Hebrew is Hebrew for a house or a home. We've anglicized it a bit to sound more like Beth than bait in English. So for example, we talk about Bethlehem, but if you're in Jerusalem, they'll talk about Bethlehem. We talk about Bethel, house of God, but it would be Bethel, which is house of God. Bethlehem or Bethlehem basically means house of bread. So the name Nadab in its purest form, its DNA, basically means something which is freely given or sacrificed, and in so doing it creates a doorway, an opening for the house or for the home. So Nadab's name was a calling. When you think of it, Aaron was a priest, and he and his brother Moses had led the people from Egypt. So he would have known long ago that there was something significant about his children. He was an honorable man. So he would have given a calling to his children. And basically that name Nadab was a calling to be a free will offering, or put it another way, to make a perfect offering for the benefit of the house of Israel. Aaron's second son, Abihu or Abaihu, takes his name from the Hebrew word Ab, meaning father. So Abihu literally means he is my father. He was a father figure. He was a father to the people. And again, he had a noble calling to be a loving father who took his responsibilities seriously and cared for those in his family. Before this morning, you maybe weren't familiar with the names Nadab and Abihu, but they actually were up there along with Moses and Aaron. If we look a bit more closely at the events described in Exodus 24, verse 1, we read that Moses was told, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar." So they were actually singled out along with the 70 elders of Israel. A couple of chapters later, in Exodus 28, verse 1, Nadab and Abihu were named among the priests. So I'm just going to begin reading at the last verse of Exodus 27 and just read a couple of verses to you. In the tent of meeting, outside the veil that is before the testimony, Aaron and his sons shall tend it from evening to morning before the Lord. It shall be a statute forever to be observed throughout their generations by the people of Israel. Chapter 28, verse 1. Then bring near to you Aaron your brother and his sons with him from among the people of Israel to serve me as priests, Aaron and Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar. So it wasn't as if they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They had been chosen as Aaron's sons to be priests. The next puzzling question is this reference to strange fire or unauthorized fire. It certainly seems to be a major issue, or it seems to have been a major issue in their day. If we just remind ourselves first of the actual verse in Leviticus 10, a simple translation of the Hebrew would be, "And the sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, each took his censer and put in it fire, and put on it incense, and offered before Yahweh profane fire, or unauthorized fire, which he had not commanded them." Profane is not a word that we often use in our everyday language. Profane means blasphemous or irreligious, secular. Some English translations say that it was profane fire, and others say unauthorized, strange fire. And I always assumed that if the fire was blasphemous, then the problem was with the source of the fire. But if we take another look at the first verse of Leviticus 10, Nadab and Abihu put fire in their censers and incense and offered profane fire before God. I would nearly have expected it to say that they put profane fire on the censer and incense, but it simply says they put fire on their censers and incense on the fire, and then they offered profane or unauthorized fire, which he had not commanded them. The word which many of our English Bibles have translated as unauthorized or profane or strange fire is the word zara, like the word Sarah, but with a Z at the beginning, zara, from the root word zor, meaning to be a stranger. And it is a strange word. Maybe if I talk around its meaning a little bit, it will throw a bit more light on the word. Zor has the idea of being a bit extra to a proper family relationship. A bit on the side, we might say, a harlot, a prostitute. The most primitive form of the word is essentially to turn aside from the home, from what is good, and to make use of a prostitute. We use the expression an extramarital affair, and well, maybe that could be a fairly simple way to sum up the idea of offering a strange fire. I know that's not going to make very much sense at this stage, but as I go on, you will realize what I mean. Just hold that thought. So we've just read in Leviticus 10 verse 1 that they took fire in their fire carriers. So there was nothing wrong with the fire that they lifted. It was from the same source of fire that everyone took fire for their sacrifices. They took fire in their fire carriers along with the incense. And then they offered prostitute fire, which God had not commanded them. Prostitute fire in the sense that outside of the normal relationship with God, that's what they offered. So something seems to have happened to that fire, that offering, to make it unacceptable in the way that they were carrying it. They were called to be priests, and Aaron was of the tribe of Levi, and they were Levitical priests, but something about the way they carried out their duties meant they weren't doing things the way God wanted. They weren't being true to God. Now, we need to take another step back and look at the big picture to see what is happening as Aaron and his sons begin to minister in the tabernacle. Exactly 1 year earlier, Moses led his people out of Egypt. So as the people remembered the events of the Passover on their first anniversary, Aaron and his sons were called to be consecrated and anointed to serve in the tabernacle. Leviticus chapter 8 described how God told Moses to take Aaron and his sons and the anointing oil and the bull, 2 rams, some unleavened bread, and summon the people. And it was quite an initiation process. A lot was going on here. You don't need to remember every detail. And as you will see, there is a lot of detail. But I'm going to focus on this very detail rather than skip over it, as I've said before, because God is in the detail. Now, please don't think you need to remember or list all of the things that were done like some sort of religious generation game conveyor belt where you need to desperately remember all that passes by. I just want you to focus for the next couple of minutes on the thoroughness of the instructions that God gave Moses, and then how Moses and Aaron responded. And if it sounds like a lot of information, then it is. You have precisely got the very point that I'm trying to make. I'm just going to paraphrase the chapter to make it a little bit more digestible. But don't remember it, just let it wash over. I just want you to get the idea that God was very specific and the instructions were quite extensive. First of all, Aaron and his sons were ceremonially washed. They were dressed and they were given ephods, which were like sashes, and breastplates and turbans. The tabernacle, it was anointed with oil. The bull of the sin offering was sacrificed, and Moses took the blood and consecrated the altar and burnt the fat and liver on the altar. The first ram was sacrificed, and it was burnt on the altar, and it was a burnt offering pleasing to the Lord. Then a second ram was sacrificed, and Moses took some of the blood, put it on Aaron's right earlobe, his right thumb, his right big toe, and consecrated him. Then Moses did exactly the same with all of Aaron's sons before burning the fat and the liver of the second ram on the altar. Then Aaron and his sons gave a wave offering, waving the unleavened bread that had been dipped in the fat before burning them on the altar. Moses took the anointing oil and he anointed Aaron and his sons. Aaron and his sons were then instructed to boil up the meat at the entrance to the tent of meeting and there eat it along with the bread from the basket of ordination offerings. I'm just going to read a couple of verses from Leviticus 8, verse 33. And you shall not go outside the entrance of the tent of meeting for 7 days until the days of your ordination are completed, for it will take 7 days to ordain you. And has been done today, the Lord has commanded to be done to make atonement for you. And Aaron and his sons did all the things that the Lord commanded by Moses. Isn't it great to think that when God says do something, that's all you need to do is just do what he said, and you know that you've done enough. Leviticus 9 is of a very similar ilk. Now that their ordination was complete, Aaron seems to be taking more of a lead and continuing to make the sacrifices as Moses had shown him. On the 8th day, Moses called Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel, and he said to Aaron, take for yourself a bull calf for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering, both without blemish, and offer them before the Lord. And say to the people of Israel, take a male goat for a sin offering, and a calf and a lamb, both a year old, without blemish, for a burnt offering, and an oak and a ram for peace offerings to sacrifice before the Lord, and a grain offering mixed with oil, for today the Lord will appear to you. Verses 8 to 21 describe how Aaron and his sons followed the instructions to a T. Aaron killed the bull calf. His sons handed him the blood to consecrate the altar. Then he burnt the fat and the liver on the altar of the calf, which was the sin offering, and the ram, which was the burnt offering, and the male goat, and a calf, and a lamb, and an ox, and a ram for peace offerings, and finally, the grain offering. You may be beginning to think, how many offerings needed to be made? The bull, the calf, the ram, the male goat, another calf, a lamb, an ox, another ram, and more grain. God had thought of everything in his instructions to Moses. There was the external cleansing of the priests, the consecration of the altar and the priests, the anointing of the tent of offering and the priests, the sin offering, the burnt offering, the peace offering, the grain offering. God had everything in hand. God knew what needed to be done so that as a holy God set apart, he could make his presence known to his people in this tent of meeting, this tabernacle. And this is very important. Please do not miss what happened next. Just as a wee aside, you may know the Torah was originally written with no chapter and verse numbers and no headings. In fact, it was written as one very long word with no full stops to divide the sentences. Verse numbers, chapter headings, chapter numbers were all later additions by scribes and then scholars who were translating the Hebrew into Latin and then English. I'm saying this because I believe the key to understanding what Nadab and Abihu did wrong is much clearer if we read the 2 consecutive verses without stopping for the new chapter heading. So I'm going to read the last 3 verses of Leviticus 9 and then the first verse of Leviticus 10, and I hope this will all start to make a lot more sense. Then Aaron lifted up his hand towards the people and blessed them, and he came down from offering the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offerings. And Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting, and when they came out, they blessed the people. And the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people, and fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering. Wow. And the pieces of fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer, put fire in it, laid incense on it, and offered an extra fire, an unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. It's exactly the same phrase. And fire came out from the Lord and consumed the burnt offering. Next verse, or 2 verses later, and fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them. What were they thinking? God had revealed his intricate plan. He knew what preparations needed to be made, the sin offerings, the burnt offerings, the peace offerings, the ceremonial cleansing, the anointing, the consecration, and then Nadab, whose name means generous, noble, free will offering, a willing volunteer, and his brother Abihu suddenly take it upon themselves to put some of this fire in their fire carriers and approach the Lord. They had just witnessed a spectacular display of divine pyrotechnics, and fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offerings. And Nadab and Abihu decide to go completely off-piste, light a couple of torches, throw some incense on the fire, and approach the Lord, where they had just seen a sacrificial ram disappear in flames. What did they think would happen? The fire of the Lord consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Their decision, and it was their decision to take some of the fire and approach the altar, might be considered a beautiful free will offering, but God did not require them to make that offering. They had been chosen to be priests, but they were carried away with the magnitude and glory of their calling. They had forgotten that the most important job they could do was simply obey what they had been told to do. There was systematic control in how the altar was consecrated. Aaron and his sons were ceremonially cleansed and dressed and anointed and consecrated, and the offerings were carried out with precision. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering. But the Lord would not have done that if they hadn't followed it to the T. And the pieces of fat on the altar, and when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. And Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer, put fire in it, laid incense on it, and offered strange prostitute fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. That fire was prostitute fire because it was extra to the relationship. Their relationship with God was based upon following the law to the letter. And they had done it. And then they just thought, let's just throw ourselves in too. They were never meant to be sacrifices. As priests, they represented God before men and men before God. The calves, the rams, the lambs, they were the offerings. These were the sacrifices that God required, that God had ordained. They were young, they were inexperienced. We might even say their enthusiasm was commendable, but it would bring a very early end to their ministry. We might think it's great to take initiative, but in so doing, Nadab and Abihu were acting outside of the authority of God. So what should they have done? To this day, members of the Aaronic priesthood, that's the priesthood of Aaron, because I may not be pronouncing it right, the Aaronic priesthood, not ironic, but Aaronic priesthood, are expected to be good husbands and fathers. We're maybe more familiar with the Roman Catholic practice of priests practicing celibacy, but in the Aaronic priesthood, the priest was called to be a good husband and a good father. Now we know that Nadab and Abihu were Aaron's eldest two sons, but there's no mention of their wives' names. Either they weren't married because they didn't place a high value on a marriage relationship, or they were married, but they didn't place a high value on their marriage relationship, and their wives' names weren't even mentioned. They were lost in obscurity. You might think I'm judging them a little bit harshly, but it's because I have read another verse relating to them, and it's found in Numbers chapter 3, verse 4. Nadab and Abihu died before the Lord when they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai, and they had no children. So Eleazar and Ithamar, who were their brothers, served as priests in the lifetime of their father. I did a bit of research. To become a priest in the Aaronic priesthood, you needed to be a minimum age of 16. So for Nadab and Abihu to have been old enough to have had children who could have been considered for the priesthood, they would have been at least in their early to mid-30s when this event occurs. But there's something else which is actually more interesting. They had no children, and there's no mention of them being married, but Aaron was 83. Bearing in mind, this was basically a year after they approached Pharaoh, because we know, Aaron would have been 84, because Aaron was 83 when he and his 80-year-old brother Moses visited Pharaoh 1 year earlier. So realistically, Nadab and Abihu to have had a father who was 84 were probably well into their 50s or 60s when they were called into the priesthood. So we have Nadab, whose name meant a generous or noble free will offering, who foolishly went down in flames of glory when he was meant to faithfully serve God as a priest. And Abihu, who was called to be a father, after all, his name meant he is my father, who also didn't get round to being a good husband or a father. So when I began to study these verses, I didn't know where they would take me. I was just fascinated by the phrase, a strange fire, but I had no preconceived ideas about what it might mean. I just decided to look at the facts, present them without any bias or agenda, and I was stunned at how we have missed the simplicity of the text. The clues are all there. Aaron's sons were told to fulfill the role of priests, and instead they decided to go just one stage further and become the burnt offering. And that's not how ministry should work. How many of our deacons, our elders, our pastors, church leaders, kids workers, community workers, volunteers are so focused on going the extra mile in ministry that they've neglected their wives, their husbands, their children, their families, running from meeting to meeting like headless chicken. God had a plan for Abihu. It was tied up in his name. He was to become a father, yet he never had children. Nadab was called to be noble and generous, yet he became this freakish free will offering, out of control, reduced to ashes in his prime. The God of creation was a God of enough. He knew when to stop creating and rest on the seventh day. He knew when to stop destroying when he made a covenant with Noah that he would never again destroy mankind and sent a rainbow as a sign of this pledge. God knew when enough was enough. Enthusiasm and intuition are admirable traits when they're coupled with wisdom and integrity. Every pastoral minister is probably crying out for enthusiastic volunteers, while every congregation is probably celebrating if their leaders are dedicated and sold out for their vocation. But God has a plan. God knows the master plan, and it involves balance and families and knowing when enough is enough. Doing our best and trusting God, and that's the key, is trusting God to bring the multiplication. The Israelites had left their slavery behind, but there would always be a temptation to become slaves to a new system, a new world order. Yahweh was their father, their creator. He would provide a lamb. He would lead and he would protect them, and he would make a way. The excitement of being part of this new Aaronic priesthood was understandable, and it would have been an incredible privilege for Nadab and Abihu, whether they were 16 years old or 60 years old, to have been instrumental when the God who created the universe was making his presence felt in a tabernacle in the wilderness of Sinai desert. But God wasn't a circus sideshow. God wasn't a one-trick pony. God wasn't a genie in a bottle at Nadab's beck and call. Nadab couldn't just click your fingers and expect God to perform a miracle. God is holy, separate, and set apart. And it is dangerously presumptuous for any church leader to sacrifice himself or herself and their family in order to be seen as one who knows God. To become one of his ministers or priests and to remain in that position can only be done his way. I'm going to repeat that. To become one of his ministers or priests and to remain in that position can only be done his way. But there are still a couple of other loose ends to tie up. I mentioned earlier that Moses immediately gave the instruction to Aaron and Eleazar and Ithamar, who were Aaron's two remaining sons, that they should not uncover their heads or tear their clothes, lest they die and wrath come upon all the people. And Aaron held his peace. Everyone was in shock. Nadab and Abihu had disappeared in flames, and Moses was worried about whether they wore hats or not and the state of their clothing. Once more, if we look a little bit more closely at the original Hebrew text, it will shed a bit more light on the situation. Moses actually told Aaron and the two younger sons, do not para your head. That's P-A-R-A in English, para. Para meaning to let loose or go wild or avenge. There is no mention of loosening hair or wearing hats. Moses said, keep your heads about you. Do not let your heads go wild. Do not let your minds get out of control. We might say, keep your cool, hold on to your hats, stay calm. Moses also warned them, do not tear your clothes. Now, this is an interesting phrase. The word rapam, R-A-P-A-M, occurs 3 times in the Old Testament, and every time it is in the book of Leviticus. And it is more than simply tearing a garment. It carries the idea of cutting and weeping. It's actually the verb used in ancient cultures to mean chopping onions. So it's an action that combines tearing or chopping while crying uncontrollably. So going off on a complete tangent for a brief moment, did you ever wonder how the English word tear, as in teardrop, is spelt the same way as the word tear, as in to cut or rend? All of our modern languages are derived from early Semitic languages, and that there's actually evidence in this fact that tear and tear are spelt the same way, that tearing and tearing were more closely related than we appreciate today in the West. All of our modern languages are derived from early Semitic languages, And there's evidence here that tearing and tearing were more closely linked than we appreciate, as for generations we've told men, suppress your emotions as big boys don't cry. And as I was writing it, the chorus line of that chart-topping song, Big Girls Don't Cry, performed by the Four Seasons, was just ringing through my ears. But today, if we travel east to Israel or Africa or Southeast Asia, they have a very different attitude towards grief. When a loved one dies, the grief is uncontrollable. When a father loses his son or a son loses his father, then the bereaved will tear their clothes and cry in anguish uncontrollably. There are other words for grief and mourning found in the Old Testament, but this word rapam, to tear your clothes and cry uncontrollably, is only found in the priestly book of Leviticus. And you may have already made the connection where I'm going with the temple situation in Matthew 27. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. Then behold, the veil of the Lord was torn in two from top to bottom. That's Matthew 27, verses 50 and 51. We know that the temple veil separated the Holy of Holies from the outer courts. And when the veil was rent in two, as Jesus offered up his spirit, the holy place where God's glory resided became accessible. But it was more than that. The temple veil was rent in two from top to bottom. It was the Father's expression of grief and anguish at the sacrifice of his son, as an Eastern father would tear his clothes and cry at the death of his son. Yet Moses told them not to let their heads go loose, not to wildly tear their clothes and cry and mourn. And Aaron held his peace. He said nothing. Yes, he probably knew that his sons had acted recklessly and immaturely, but Aaron also knew that God had instructed very specific sacrifices be offered. Historians and archaeologists are in no doubt that it was common practice in Canaan for children to be offered as sacrifices. There is a valley which is maybe more of a ravine, and I've actually seen it just outside the city of Jerusalem, and it's known as the Valley of Hinnom. In biblical times, there were many pagan practices, and one of the most well-documented ones was the passing of children through fire to appease the god Moloch. I'm not going to go into detail about how it was done, but it is quite horrific what people did. God instructed Moses. Moses instructed Aaron and his sons quite explicitly what to sacrifice and how to sacrifice. Can you imagine what it would have been like if, caught up in the theatrics of the divine pyrotechnics in the tabernacle, it had become a free-for-all of, let's see what's the most extreme sacrifice we can make. It wouldn't have been long before children and men and women would have become the sacrificial offering, because the practice was going on all around them. So to mourn Nadab and Abihu would have set an impossible precedent. God alone could decide what would be a holy and acceptable offering. God alone knew that one day his son, Yeshua, would be that perfect sacrifice to end all sacrifices. We read in Leviticus about how the calf and the bull and the ram, they were without blemish. No other person, no other human being, not Nadab, not Abihu, would be a worthy offering or sacrifice. And until that time, when Yeshua would be sacrificed, there would be no rending of garments. It was a waste, a tragic waste. But all the glory must be to the Lord. This wasn't about a human priesthood proving who was willing to sacrifice the most. For as Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord has said. Among those who are near me, I will be sanctified, and before all the people, I will be glorified." And Aaron held his peace. Aaron's sons had walked outside of the will of God, outside of the perfect plan that God had given them, and the result was tragedy. The people were in shock. There's no doubt that Aaron and his sons had been given an important job, but the most important job they could do was simply obey what they had been told to do. God had a plan, and it did not involve human sacrifices. Jesus alone would be that perfect, sinless, spotless sacrifice to end all sacrifices, and thereafter all believers would be part of that royal priesthood. Sacrifices are mentioned in the New Testament, and I believe that these verses that I'm going to read just to finish will take on fresh meaning now that we've looked more closely at the sacrificial system in Leviticus. 1 Peter 2, verses 5 to 9. As you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. To be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices which are acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Another verse which alludes to sacrifice is Romans 12, verse 1. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercy of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And do you know what is important to remember about a living sacrifice? We are alive. We have life and breath, and we are called as a royal priesthood to search out and discern what is the will of God, the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And as the tale of Nadab and Abihu has shown, our lives must be centered on obeying, not sacrificing. It's hard to come up with a single English word to translate this strange fire, this unorthodox fire, profane fire, as all of these words simply make it sound a bit mystical or new agey. But it was a prostitute fire. It was an attempt to buy God's services, to buy God's forgiveness. Maybe they thought they could improve on God's plans. Maybe they thought that sacrificing their calling to be good husbands and good fathers was worth it, to be part of this glorious sacrificial system. But it was a tragic story and a valid lesson even for today. I pray this has blessed you. Amen.